Former Gauteng Premier David Makhura is expected to take the stand in the Life Esidimeni Inquest in the High Court in Pretoria. Yesterday, former Gauteng Finance MEC Barbara Creecy concluded her testimony. This after Creecy and Makhura were implicated by the former Gauteng Health MEC Qedani Mahlangu. Now, during her recent cross-examination, Mahlangu pointed out the pair to have been behind the termination of the Life Esidimeni contract to save the department millions of rands. The move led to the death of 144 mentally ill patients. Well, our reporter Nozintombi Miya is on this story. Let's cross to her now for more. Nozintombi, a good morning to you. I think this really is so much to cover here, and a lot that the former finance MEC had to answer yesterday that was alleged by the former health MEC. I think give us a rundown of what we heard from Minister Creecy yesterday.
Yeah, thank you so much, Naledi. You know, it was quite interesting hearing Barbara Creecy's testimony yesterday, and it was quite important. And she actually put the context quite clearly. She said in 2014, around May 2014, that's when she, as well as Qedani Mahlangu, were introduced into their new portfolios. She in the portfolio of finance and Qedani Mahlangu in the portfolio of health. And at the time, the impression had been that there'd been quite a lot of corruption, underspending and overspending in the health department. And the mandate that had been given by them coming in was to ensure that they clean up the rot inside the Gauteng Health department. And one of the cost-cutting measures was to ensure that the belts are tightened up, and areas of possible corruption are removed, or areas of possible corruption are cleared up or cleaned up. But unfortunately, in them attempting to do cost-cutting, in them attempting to be transparent, in them attempting to make sure that specifically core services are paid for, this is where it all went wrong. Because what Barbara Creecy was saying yesterday is that while she was a member of the Premier's Budget Committee, there was never a point where they emphatically told the Department of Gauteng to cut the contract with Life Esidimeni. In fact, she said that they told the Gauteng Health Department to ensure that they do not cut any core services and only they should trim off the fat and not the bulk or the lean meat or the important parts that were necessary. And those would be the parts that would affect the lives of the patients that are in the care of the healthcare department in Gauteng. And she says that in subsequent meetings at the Premier's budget meeting or the committee meeting, they had asked the Gauteng Health Department whether or not they had sufficient capacity to house the 3,000 mental health care patients that they would be removing from Life Esidimeni. And she was told that even in the recordings, they assured her that they had the capacity, they would bolster the capacity in the private healthcare, in the public healthcare facilities, as well as moving to NGOs. And she says she recalls in one of the meetings that Gauteng Health had said that they wanted to reduce the beds by about 20% from Life Esidimeni for them to be able to make an annual saving of about 50 million rands. And you recall that at that time in 2014, for the 2014-2015 budget, the budget for Gauteng Health had been in excess of 31 billion rands. So that was a saving that they said that they would make if they cut the contract. But again, Barbara Creecy refuting what Qedani Mahlangu was saying and saying that there was never a point in the Premier's budget committee where they emphatically said that the Gauteng Health Department, as well as the HODs, should ensure that they cut the contract with Life Esidimeni. She even went a step further and said that at the executive level that they were at, they would never have been able to interfere in contract matters. And only the highest ranking accounting officer in the health department itself, that would be the person that would have been able to have control of whether or not the contracts are cancelled or not cancelled. So now, lady, it is going to be absolutely important today to hear what Premier Makhura says today, whether or not he corroborates what Barbara Creecy had said in her testimony yesterday. And you'll recall that Premier Makhura in 2018, when he had initially testified before former Deputy Chief Justice Qedani Mahlangu at the inquest, he'd apologized to the families for what he'd done wrong, and he'd said he would ultimately take responsibility as the head of the region for what had occurred to the families and the trauma and the tragedy that the families of the 144 Life Esidimeni families went through, as well as the 3,000 patients that were moved to NGOs that were ill-equipped and unprepared to simply take care of them, Naledi.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see just really how this unfolds. And I want to quote a little bit from Creecy yesterday. And I want to read this out. She says, "My understanding is that mental health services are statutory services. The PBC would not, in its normal functioning, cut any statutory service. I can tell you this because I used to be MEC of Education. The PBC would never have said to me, close schools, we don't have any money for schools." So what are we hoping to hear from the former Premier then today? I mean, what happens when Mr. Makhura comes into the inquest and essentially corroborates what we've heard from Creecy?
Yeah, so just to read a quote for you to add on to what Barbara Creecy was talking about, Naledi. You know, when he was testifying in 2018 at the inquest, Makhura had said that at the Premier's Budget Committee, he'd had assurances from both the former Gauteng Health MEC, Qedani Mahlangu, as well as the head of department, Bani Silabo, that the department had the capacity to house these patients. And he said, again, you know, that statement in itself corroborates exactly what Barbara Creecy was talking about core services being maintained, about the Gauteng Health Department not making it clear and emphatic what impact the cancellation of the Life Esidimeni contract would have had on these families. And, you know, Naledi, it raises the question of whether or not it was obvious neglect or it was intentional neglect by the HODs, by the heads of departments in the Gauteng Health Department, or it was a simple case of them thinking that they were going to reduce the contract and save close to 300 million rands in cutting the Life Esidimeni, would ultimately be able to save their budget and put the Gauteng Health Department back on track and re-establish their reputation. Or it was a simple case of they simply did not care about the lives of the 3,000 mental health care patients because they did not have a proper plan. They did not institute things properly. They did not do site inspections at all the different NGOs that they had said that they would be able to take these 3,000 patients to. So it raises the question of there clearly was negligence. But at what level was the negligence? Was the negligence at the level of executive? Did executive powers, and this is Premier Makhura, this is former Finance Minister Barbara Creecy, did they put so much pressure on the Department of Health that they felt that the only thing that they had to do was to try and cancel as many contracts as they could, and try and make sure that they cleared up their budget to be seen on the positive side? Or was it a case of the fact that it was a coordinated attempt by the HODs, by the heads of department in the Gauteng Health Department at that time to ensure that they cut costs at the expense of the people? And it's this inquest that is so important to help us pinpoint who the true culprits are so that they can be held accountable, and that the families of those 144 Esidimeni patients do finally receive justice.